The Victorian era was riddled with toxic products and deadly fashion trends, but there was perhaps none more disastrous than the crinoline skirt, which would send around 3,000 women to their graves. All it took was a gust of wind, a stray spark, or a moment's inattention to send a woman to her grave. Welcome back to our channel where we discuss the trends of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I'm Alexin, and this is Trends of the Times. The crinoline cage was a good idea in theory, and it was welcomed by women with great relief. Prior to its invention, women would layer up to 14 pounds of petticoats to achieve the fullest effect. During this time, the most fashionable look was an extremely wide skirt, which also gave the illusion of a tiny waist. And regardless of season, weather, or temperature, women would layer as many petticoats as they needed to achieve this effect. But as you can imagine, it could be quite uncomfortable and inconvenient. But in April of 1856, Parisian inventor R.C. Millier patented the crinoline cage skirt, which completely revolutionized the trend. This new skirt, constructed with lightweight steel hoops suspended by tape, could replace all of those layers of petticoats. It was lighter, more breathable, even better because of the construction of this skirt. These cage skirts could be made larger than any amount of petticoats could achieve. And as the years went on, these skirts became larger and larger, creating an even more fashionable and desirable look. The crinoline cage was a no-brainer, and women of every social class loved it and wore it. In August of 1862, the London Evening Standard newspaper sang the praises of the crinoline cage skirt, noting that even the Queen of England herself wore one. Ironically, and in sharp contrast, the next page of the same newspaper announced the death of 18-year-old Sarah Padley, who had died after burning in her crinoline cage. And unfortunately, Sarah was not the only woman who would meet this fate. The crinoline cage proved to be incredibly dangerous. Stories at the time circulated of heavy winds catching these skirts, knocking women off of piers into the water below, where the steel cages tied to their waists quickened their drowning. On multiple occasions, the hoops even got entangled in carriage wheels, violently dragging women behind them. The truth is that the crinoline cage was doomed from the beginning, or rather, the women who wore them were doomed. One particularly brutal account was detailed in an 1864 Irish newspaper titled "Machinery Accident Through Crinoline." On a typical Friday afternoon at Firwood Bleach Works in Bolton, England, tragedy struck. A woman named Anne Rollison, who had recently been employed at the factory, was working in the mangling room when she walked over to a wall where soap was kept for the workers. Just a foot away from the wall was a spinning, steam-powered shaft that spun about 50 times per minute. As Anne reached for the soap, her dress brushed too closely to the spinning shaft, and the fabric of her skirt got caught, pulling her violently into the spinning machinery. Anne was forcefully spun for 2 or 3 minutes before the machinery could ever be stopped. Though no limbs were broken, Anne's spine had been severely broken in multiple places, and 2 hours later she would pass away from her injuries. A witness stated that she would not have been caught in the machinery had it not been for her crinoline cage skirt. See, although these skirts offered a clever solution for women's comfort and style, the issues were apparent. Truth be told, these skirts were lurking death traps. The most concerning issue with these skirts lied in their construction. Crinoline skirts seemed to incorporate everything necessary to cause a deadly fire. They were made of highly flammable fabric, but not only that, they contained large pockets of air which could fuel a spark, and they were so wide that women would often accidentally brush against candles, stovetops, and fires. Essentially, they were walking tinderboxes just waiting for a spark. And in Victorian times, when fires were a primary source of heat and light, sparks there were aplenty. And it is shocking how common these casualties were. On May 22, 1867, tragedy struck at Schloss Hetzendorf, the home of Empress Elizabeth, where 18-year-old Archduchess Mathilde was getting ready for a trip to the theater. After getting dressed and before leaving, she wanted to smoke a cigarette. Now, of course, during this time, smoking was not common for women, and her father had even forbidden it. Nonetheless, she stood at a window in the palace, talking with her young cousin while she smoked her cigarette. But before she was done, her father suddenly entered the room and approached her, and wanting to avoid trouble, she quickly hid her cigarette behind her dress. And unfortunately, that was all it took. Before a moment's notice, the Archduchess was up in flames. Before the fire could be extinguished, her back, arm, neck, and lower extremities had suffered severe second and third degree burns. And although she lived for many days while her wounds were tended to, the damage was just too severe. 2 weeks later, the Archduchess would pass away. 6 years earlier, in July of 1861, Fanny Longfellow, the wife of famed poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, had been melting wax with a lit candle to seal envelopes when she accidentally and unexpectedly ignited her dress. In a moment, she too was enveloped in flames. Henry, who was present, attempted to smother the flames with a rug, but it didn't work. Fanny passed away the next day, and Henry himself was left with burns to his hands and his face. Oscar Wilde's two half-sisters would also meet a similar gruesome fate in 1871. On the evening of October 31st, the sisters, Mary and Emily, attended a Halloween party at the Drummicon House in Ireland. Everything about the night had been a success right up until the end. Before the guests made their way home, the host, Andrew Reed, asked Mary for one last dance around the ballroom. This joyous end to the night quickly turned the entire event into an unforgettable tragedy. While they were dancing, Mary got too close to the candlesticks that were in the ballroom. When her dress brushed against one, it immediately caught on fire. Panic ensued and the other guests screamed in terror. Emily, of course, ran to her sister's rescue, attempting to put out the flames, but she too was wearing a crinoline, and upon getting too close, her own skirt was ignited and she went up in flames as well. Both sisters would eventually perish. In addition to these singular tragedies, there were two very public, catastrophic events that forever tarnished the reputation of the crinoline cage skirt. The first took place on the evening of September 14, 1861, where more than 1,500 people gathered at the Continental Theatre for a spectacular performance of Shakespeare's The Tempest. The theater spared no expense for this production, and it was complete with pyrotechnics as well as a large cast of young dancers who were eager to participate in such an elaborate production. Among the dancers were the four Gale sisters, Ruth, Abina, Cecilia, and Hannah Gale, who were well known for both their beauty and their talent. The show had been going perfectly, and as the first act neared its close, the ballerinas rushed off stage and to their dressing room, which was located on the second floor directly above the stage. While the show continued below and the audience watched in amazement, the ballerinas were busy upstairs, changing costumes and preparing for the next scene. But this is where the night took a horrifying turn. In the dressing room, Cecilia Gale climbed onto a settee to reach her costume that was hanging from a mirror. On both sides of the mirror were open flame gas jets, which were used to light the room. And before Cecilia could notice as she was reaching for her costume, one of the jet flames had caught her dress, and within seconds she was engulfed in flames. Screaming in panic and terror, her sisters and fellow ballerinas rushed to help, but their flammable costumes only caught fire too, and soon nearly a dozen young women were burning alive. The audience watched in stunned confusion as screams rang out from backstage, not from the play, but from real young women who were burning alive. Cecilia, still on fire, ran downstairs and past the stage screaming as the audience watched in horror. Other burning ballerinas jumped from the second floor windows, landing with large thuds on the pavement below. While the horror continued to unfold, the audience was calmly ushered out of the theater. Dancers were rushed to the hospital as the fire continued to spread across the theater. While no guests were injured, by the end of the night, the Continental Theater had completely burned down, and 9 of the ballerinas would pass away, including all 4 of the Gale sisters. The most disastrous event involving crinoline cage skirts took place on the night of December 8, 1863 in Santiago, Chile, where nearly 3,000 people gathered at a Jesuit church for a celebration. But what was supposed to be a peaceful night of worship and celebration quickly turned into a night of true terror, horror, and tragedy. To make this celebration more special, the priest, Don Juan Ugarte, had the church decorated with thousands of candles and paraffin lamps. Muslin and gauze curtains were draped from the ceiling, and all surfaces had been adorned with ribbons and paper flowers. Now, today, exit doors are required to open outward in case of a fire, but at this time, the doors to this church were inward swinging, and at 7 p.m. when the Mass was set to start, the inward swinging doors were closed to make more room for the crowd of attendees. But before the ceremony could even begin, it came to an abrupt, alarming end. The thousands of candles and open flames that were surrounded by flammable decorations proved to be an obvious fire hazard, not to mention the amount of people in attendance and the exit doors being closed shut. Now, there are many accounts as to what exactly took place first, but whether it was a stray spark or a gust of wind, a trail of flames quickly began to cover the entire building like a giant spiderweb. Panic quickly ensued, and the nearly 3,000 congregants ran in fear and panic toward the exit doors, only to find the doors shut and nearly impossible to open inward with the crowds pushing against them. And this is when the crinoline cage truly lived up to its name. Of the 3,000 in attendance, the majority were women, most of whom were wearing the stylish crinoline skirt. And for the women wearing them, these skirts truly became a cage. They became their prison. As the flames got too close, their skirts were ignited, and the women were quickly engulfed in their own inferno. This started what was like a cascade of dominoes, as one crinoline skirt that was on fire ignited another near it, until hundreds and thousands were up in flames. With the claustrophobic crowds and piles of bodies blocking the exits, the women couldn't escape the building, let alone their own cages of fire. They were trapped. 2 hours after the celebration was set to start, the church had completely burned down, and of the 3,000 in attendance, around 2,500 would perish, the majority being women who were wearing crinoline skirts. By the late 1870s, the crinoline cage had finally fallen out of fashion and out of favor with the people, but 3,000 deaths too late. During the height of its popularity, the New York Times had noted an average of 3 deaths per week involving crinoline. And one might ask, after so many accidents, and if they were so dangerous, why wouldn't they have made a safer, non-flammable skirt? And the answer is that they did, but these safer, non-flammable alternatives were simply not as fashionable. So despite the hazard and despite the risk of injury and even death, many women opted, of course, for the beauty and the fashion that these crinoline skirts provided, and many would unfortunately pay the ultimate price for it.